Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church. Our forums are free and open to the public and happen every Sunday at noon, 4700 Grover Avenue. We encourage you to attend. This morning it's my honor and pleasure to introduce State Representative Elliot Naishtat. He is from New York City originally, but fortunately decided to move to Texas, where he attended both the UT School of Social Work and he also got a law degree, and decided to go into public service. In 1990, he was elected to the State District 49 seat in the House of Representatives. He's been re-elected 11 times and serves as a member of the Human Services Committee and is vice chair of the Public Health Committee. He's also served on the Government Organization Committee, the Juvenile Justice and Family Committee, Issues Committee, the Urban Affairs Committee, and the County Affairs Committee. He's a founding board member of the Legislative Study Group, House Progressive Caucus. And over the years that he's been in office, he has passed more than 200 bills. And today he is going to be talking about our current legislative session, and he is an expert on legislative affairs and wonderfully entertaining also. So let's give a warm welcome to State Representative Elliot Naishtat.
Did Bonnie mention where I'm from? She did? Okay. So before I talk about the legislature per se, I'll answer the question that some of you have. I know Carol doesn't, and that is, how does somebody from New York City end up speaking to you today as a member of the Texas House of Representatives? Some of you may know that until I got elected, it was written in the Texas Constitution that if you're from New York City, you cannot serve in the Texas legislature. That was reluctantly changed when I won. So let's go back in time to when some of you may not have been born. I'm going to tell the story of how I ended up in the Lege. And it goes back to, I am born and bred in New York City. When I finished college in the late 1960s, I signed up to be a VISTA volunteer, Volunteers in Service to America. Most of you know that John Kennedy started the Peace Corps, where young people go overseas, and Lyndon Johnson started the Domestic Peace Corps, VISTA. Bill Clinton started his own version of the Domestic Peace Corps, and that's called AmeriCorps. So now we have AmeriCorps volunteers, VISTA volunteers, and Peace Corps volunteers. So I signed up to be a VISTA volunteer, and the people in Washington said, we would love to have you serve as a frontline warrior in Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. And they said, because you're from a big city, New York City, we'll send you to a VISTA project in a big city. And they promised me an assignment in San Francisco. And I went, yes. But you know the government, they lied and sent me to Eagle Pass. That would be Eagle Pass, Texas. Anybody here from Eagle Pass? Every now and then there's somebody from Eagle Pass, so I have to tone down my remarks. We went through VISTA training for 6 weeks in San Antonio. And they trained us to be community organizers. Who's the most famous former community organizer on earth? Barack Obama. That's right. So what they wanted us to do, and this was part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, the Economic Opportunity Act created the War on Poverty. And right in that act, it said the purpose of all of these programs is to eliminate the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty. basically to eliminate poverty. But how do you train young people from all over the country, including New York City, to eliminate poverty? How do you do that? No one really knew. So they had a bunch of social workers and people from Columbia and University of Maryland, and they said we must train them to be community organizers, to organize at the grassroots level, to get people involved at the local level. That's the way to begin the process of eliminating poverty. So they trained us to be community organizers, although nobody really knew what that meant or what it was. Saul Alinsky had written about community organizing. On the last day of training, the director, who was a social worker and a community organizer, he'd been working with gangs in San Antonio, and the director of the training program pointed to 6 of us and said, "Oh, by the way, you 6," and we were all from the East Coast, and we had each been promised assignments in San Francisco or Portland, Oregon. And the director said, "There's been a change. You're not going to San Francisco or Portland. You all are going to Eagle Pass, Texas, and tomorrow morning you'll be on a Trailways bus from San Antonio, where we had just finished training, to Eagle Pass." We thought he was joking, but he wasn't. So the next morning we were on a Trailways bus from San Antonio to Eagle Pass, and it felt like it took 3 or 4 days to get there. It took many hours, I would guess 6 or 7 hours, and the bus went down the interstate, and then it hooked right and went southwest on Highway 57, and the bus went for hours and hours and hours, and it just was going straight toward the border. For those of you who don't know where Eagle Pass is, it's on the border. It's right across the Rio Grande from Piedras Negras, Mexico. It's the county seat of Maverick County. You can't make this up. None of us had ever heard of Eagle Pass or that part of the world. None of us had ever seen that kind of South Texas scenery. Hard scrabble, brushland, desert. I do remember over a period of hours we saw some armadillo and we saw some javelina. That scared us a lot on many levels. So the bus went for hours and hours and hours, and then finally, on the outskirts of something, the bus stopped and everybody got off except the new recruits, the Vista volunteers. So I went up to the bus driver and said, "Excuse me, sir, we're supposed to be let off at the downtown Eagle Pass bus station." And the bus driver looked me in the eye and said, "You putting me on, boy?" We were there. We had arrived. The next morning, the director of the Winter Garden Tri-County Community Action Agency, serving Dimmitt, Maverick, and Zavala counties, Crystal City, Carrizo Springs, Eagle Pass. The director took us on a tour of Eagle Pass. That did not take very long. But we ended up in a low-income neighborhood, a barrio. Today it would be called a colonia, called Seco Mines. Seco means dry, no water, no sewers, no plumbing. There were about 35 or 40 houses, frame houses in this neighborhood. They were made out of wood, and considering that this was a really low-income neighborhood, the houses were in okay shape. But either next to or behind every house was an outhouse, a real outhouse. And I thought to myself, you didn't join the Peace Corps. You're not in Togo in West Africa. You're not in El Salvador. You're in the United States of America. And I thought, There are no outhouses in New York City. Well, except maybe a few in Brooklyn. No, that's a joke if anybody's from Brooklyn. And it really opened my eyes. And I could talk for an hour about what that year was like, trying to eliminate the paradox of poverty and plenty, in the midst of plenty, in Eagle Pass and Crystal Springs and Carrizo Springs and Crystal City. We were community organizers, so we started a Head Start program. There was no Head Start program, so the Vistas organized that, and we tried to implement the philosophy of the War on Poverty, which was maximum feasible participation of the poor, meaning get people involved, get low-income people involved in helping to start and run a Head Start program, so that when the Vista volunteers theoretically work themselves out of a job after a year, people from the community can take over and will know how to start their own programs. That was one of the philosophies, maximum feasible participation of the poor. It became very controversial. It also meant that low-income people would have decision-making authority in areas that related to the Community Action Agency. So the board of directors was comprised mainly of low-income people. This was maximum feasible participation of the poor. So the board would determine who would be the director of the program. They would hire and fire the director. The board would determine how in the Tri-County area $1 million in federal money would be spent. The board would determine whether or not Vista volunteers were brought in, not the county judge, not the mayor, not the elected officials. And this became very controversial over the years. So we started working in Seco Mines. During training, they spent about a week teaching us how to do a needs assessment. They said, you're going to have to go into a community. We don't want you imposing your white middle class values on these low-income people from different cultures and backgrounds. Remember, this was a national program. This was happening all over the country. So they spent a few days teaching us how to do a thorough, comprehensive needs assessment, where we would go out to the neighborhood and get people together and give them the needs assessment to fill out. So I remember we took the needs assessment to Seco Mines, and they had about 15 people who had come to this first meeting, and one of us said, okay, now to get the ball rolling so we can eliminate poverty down here, you got to fill out this needs assessment, because we don't want to impose our white middle class values on you. We want to make sure that what we do is what you need and what you want. There was a little bit of discussion, not much, and then an old man said, we don't need to fill out no needs assessment. And I said, we just went through 6 weeks of training. We do need for you to fill out this needs assessment. He said, if you can help us get water, we'll work with you. If you can't, go back to New York. We don't need a needs assessment. So we worked on that. Again, I don't have time to talk all about that amazing year in Eagle Pass. I will share one story that relates to Head Start. So it was now the middle of summer, and it was really hot. I know that during the summer when it was really hot in Eagle Pass, in Crystal City, in Carrizo Springs, I would wear sandals and cutoffs and a T-shirt. My hair was a little bit longer, and I would sweat. Mucho. So we had about 70 kids in the backyard of this house that some of the Vistas were renting on El Indio Road. A lot of volunteers from the community and Vista volunteers. And all of a sudden, a car that none of us had ever seen pulled up into the driveway. And this man, all dressed up in a coat and tie, got out and walked over to the gate, to the fence, and was looking over, and all these kids were outside that time, and Vistas were there and community people. And he's looking, and then he opens the gate, and he walks through a bunch of kids, and he walks right up to me, and he starts laughing out loud in my face, just laughing. So I stood there. It felt like a couple of minutes. It was probably 30 or 40 seconds, and he's laughing. And finally I said, "Sir, is there some problem? Can we help you?" He laughed a little more, and then he caught his breath and said, No, there's no problem. There's no problem. He said, "I just went to work for the War on Poverty, for the VISTA program." He said, out of Austin, because back then the regional office of VISTA was in Austin. The regional office meaning for a 5-state area. He said, "I'm now responsible for all the VISTA projects in South Texas and West Texas." He said, "I'm the new program officer for that part of Texas." And he said, "I had to come down to Eagle Pass first because I really wanted to meet the guy from New York City who thought he was going to San Francisco." And he put out his hand and said, "My name is Gonzalo Barrientos." So for any one of you who don't know, Senator Barrientos served with distinction in the House and in the Senate for many, many years. He retired, I guess 4, maybe 6 years ago. And Kirk Watson is now the senator. But that's how I met Gonzalo Barrientos, who became a mentor to me over the years. So let me fast forward a little bit. By the way, usually I'm asked at this point, "Well, what did you accomplish down there?" And my answer is always, "Don't you remember the front page story in the New York Times in 1968, which read, 'Poverty eliminated in Eagle Pass, Texas'?" We did a lot of community organizing. We developed a lot of local leadership potential. Down the line, some of the kids in the teen club we worked with ended up on the city council. We got young people, one woman who worked at the Newberries and was going to work there for the rest of her life, like her mother. We convinced her to go to the junior college in Uvalde, and when she finished that, she went on to the University of Texas. She got a master's degree. She ended up a principal in the Edgewood Independent School District in San Antonio, which has a whole history that led to many Supreme Court rulings in Texas. So I spent 2 more years supervising VISTA volunteers and training VISTA volunteers all over the Southwest United States. And I did this until it was time for me to leave VISTA. And I had met, some of you may have known Jack Otis. He was the dean of the UT School of Social Work. And I had met him at a party. And he said, "What are you going to do when you leave VISTA?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Why don't you come to graduate school at the UT School of Social Work?" He said, "We have a new program called Community Organizing and Social Planning." And he said, "To be honest, we don't have too many professors who have much experience in community organizing." He said, "Well, to be perfectly honest, we don't have any." And he said, "At least you would be there with all your experience, serving, organizing, training, supervising." And he said, "You would get a master's degree in social work, in community organizing and planning and policy." And he said, "We have a bunch of federal scholarship money." And I did that. And my first block field placement was with Legal Aid, the Community Legal Services program, which John Scanlon and Barbara Kazin ran. And for me, that was not very challenging because there were 40 law students doing their on-the-job training. And there was one social work community organizer. And so I worked with, I'll never forget when 2 or 3 of the law students came over and said, "Elliot, you're the organizer, and we need some help." And I said, "Sure." He said, "We're supposed to go interview some people in the Booker T. Washington Housing Project. and we don't know where it is, and we would like you to be with us when we go talk to some of these people. But I did a lot of organizing, welfare rights organizing, tenants' rights organizing in the Blackshear neighborhood. The whole time, by the way, I was living in Clarksville, old Clarksville, and I got very involved. First, getting the streets paved and sewers put into Clarksville, and then trying to keep the developers from taking over and displacing everyone. My second block placement was with the Legislative Budget Board. The dean said to me, "You've done all this community organizing, grassroots. Every time when you left New York, that's all you've done, basically, is organizing at the grassroots level." He said, "I want you to get a different perspective on trying to address the issues that you focus on." He said, "Go down to the Capitol, find out what the Legislative Budget Board is." And he said, "I've made some calls, and we'd like you to do your block field placement there." And I did, and that exposed me to a whole other world, the world of the Texas legislature. The Legislative Budget Board, as some of you may know, is one of the most important agencies. It develops the proposed budget for the state of Texas. One of the reasons why the lieutenant governor is considered more powerful than the governor is that by statute, the lieutenant governor of Texas chairs the Legislative Budget Board. I learned a lot. During that period, Gonzalo Barrientos ran for the House of Representatives, 1972. He lost the first time. Well, I helped organize his campaign. He asked me to. And he came back in 1974 and won and started his career in the House of Representatives. In the meantime, after I finished graduate school, the dean called me again and said, "We got another grant from HEW, the federal agency, and we're going to start a legislative internship program. We'll be the first graduate school of social work in the nation to have one." And he said, "I was thinking, and you're perfect to run it. You helped Gonzalo Barrientos. You've worked down at the Legislative Budget Board. You have a master's degree in social work and policy and planning, and we'd love for you to run it." It would start the next year. And I did. So for 3 years, I was on the faculty. They wanted me to have an office down at the School of Social Work. And I think I had an office. I'm not sure, because I ran the program out of Representative Gonzalo Barrientos' office, of course. I said, "Can I do that, Gonzalo?" And he said, "Yeah, sure, you can do it, but give me the best intern you have." And these interns worked on a full-time basis and got 12 graduate hours and a master's degree. I have been supervising graduate interns from the School of Social Work ever since then. There's not a formal program, but I get 2 graduate students from the UT School of Social Work every semester, and they work on a full-time basis and get a lot of credit and their degree, and so do some other members. So I did that for about 3, maybe 4 years. Then I had my first midlife crisis. The most important thing you may take from this, if you don't already know it, is that you don't necessarily have only one midlife crisis, okay? Write that down. So I had my first midlife crisis because the federal funds dried up. There was no more legislative training unit. And I was thinking, well, I'm not sure what to do next, so maybe I'll go to school more. And the crisis was whether I should go to graduate school and get a PhD. That's what the dean wanted me to do, and faculty members. Go to the Florence Heller Institute for Advanced Studies in Social Welfare, get a PhD. But Gonzalo Barrientos and Wilhelmina Delco and Lloyd Doggett, with whom I've been working at the Capitol through the internship program, they said if you're going to go to school more, go to law school. If you want to teach, you can teach with a JD, and a law degree and license gives you more clout. And I suffered through law school, and when I finished, I worked for a little while, but then Gonzalo Barrientos, who had moved over to the Senate, called me and said, "Elliot, do you remember how we used to ride the range fighting poverty in South Texas?" I went, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, well, I'm in the Senate now, and you have all these degrees, and I trust you and respect you, and I need you to come work for me as my staff attorney, my staff counsel. And he said, I can pay you what we paid you when you were a Vista volunteer, but I can get you a parking place near the Capitol, he said. So I did that for 3 years, 2 sessions. It was very exciting. He was the chair of the Select Committee on Elder Abuse, so I got to work on all of those issues. A young man named Mark Seeberger had been pressured or forced to drink so much alcohol pledging a fraternity that he died. So Barrientos said, I want the toughest anti-hazing statute in the nation. I want it to be used as model legislation. We did that. And another committee that he chaired dealt with dropout prevention. We worked on that. And I really enjoyed doing that. And one day we were sitting around Schultz's, and some people said, Elliot, you ought to run for the House. You'd be great. And I said, no, I don't think so. And they said, no, you ought to run against that 3-term Republican incumbent in North Austin. And I said, no, I don't think so. And they said, why not? I said, well, because I would lose. This guy's knocked off everybody. I'm from New York City. I'm Jewish, and I'm an ex-Vista volunteer. So he would accuse me of being a communist. Barrientos, he was there. He said, let's talk a little bit. He said, you ought to do it. I think you'd have an okay shot against the incumbent. We'll call him Bob because that's his name. So Barrientos said, if you run, 2 things. He said, don't talk about a state income tax. He said, it's the kiss of death. He said, more importantly, never mention that you're from New York City. And I decided to do it. And I didn't have any money. Several different consulting groups came to me and said, for $15,000, for $20,000, for $30,000, we'll organize and run your campaign. And I thought to myself, I don't have any money. All I've been doing since I left New York is community organizing. Why can't I organize and run my campaign? And I did. We got the Gray Panthers very involved because I'd worked on the elder abuse projects. And I had over 100 volunteers, and I went door to door, every day, because I knew I would have to go door to door to counter whatever the incumbent Bob would say about me. When I went door to door, and I did this for months, I didn't call for a state income tax. I wasn't suicidal. I wanted to win. But I would tell people, I would ask people on their front porch, I would say, we have a $4 billion shortfall. This was 1990. Remember, the shortfall last session was $27 billion. We have a $4 billion shortfall, and Texas ranks at the bottom of the ladder in every important category of health and human services spending. We rank 47th, 49th, 48th, 50th, and I would say on their porches. And we rank 52nd in per capita spending on alcohol and substance abuse. And people would say, how can we be 52nd? How can we be 52nd? And I would say, because we're behind Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. This was in mental health and substance abuse issues. I said, we need to generate $4 billion just to stay at the bottom of the ladder. Everything ought to be on the table. I said, everything ought to be on the table. I said, the only way I'd support an income tax if we link it to restructuring the whole tax system so the property tax and the sales tax come way down. I still believe that. I never mentioned, that I was from New York City. So this went on for months. What do you think the incumbent was doing during that period? Nothing. He'd knocked off every Democrat, and he wasn't too worried about me. So at some point, we figure in late October, his consultants, he had a lot of consultants. He had a lot of money. I don't know how much, but 3-term Republican incumbent. And we assumed that they had a conversation with him and said, hey, Bob, there's nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. You're going to beat this guy. He's from New York City. He's Jewish. He's an ex-Vista volunteer communist, but He's generating a lot of interest. He's picking up some endorsements. Let's not blow it. Let's go up on TV. So they did with a commercial that people who saw it and consultants still talk about. It was very, very clever. He did a takeoff on the original Pace Picante sauce commercial. For those of you who don't know, there's a bunch of cowboys, group of cowboys sitting around the campfire eating supper. And they run out of the Pace hot sauce. So the cook brings them some other hot sauce. And one of the cowboys looks at the jar and takes the top off and smells it or tastes it and says, "This ain't Pace Picante sauce. This stuff was made in New York City. Get a rope." So Bob's commercial, predictably enough, started out with the skyline of New York. And then the voice said, "New York City? Do you want a liberal social worker from New York City?" Then the Pace Picante jar appeared on the screen with my photo superimposed over the logo. And they got a look-alike cowboy from the real Pace Picante sauce ad. And he said, "New York City, I'll bet he's for a state income tax. Income tax? Get a rope." So I won by a little over 10 percentage points. I took the oath of office the same week that Ann Richards did in January of 1991. I've lived through the wonderful Ann Richards era. I lived through the George Bush era, and now the Rick Perry era. So I've seen it all. I did somehow figure out how to quietly pass a lot of bills. So I guess I've been down there for about 11 sessions. I would say in 6 or 7 of those sessions, I ended up passing the most bills in the House of Representatives. But people don't know it. The Chronicle always says, "Now, what did stealth Representative Elliot Naishtat do this session?" And then they talk about it. I have passed over 200 bills. Some of them were good. No, all of them were good. It's been quite challenging and quite exciting. So now I want to tell you why I'm optimistic about the next session. It's going to be better than recent sessions. It's not going to be good, but it's going to be better for 2 reasons. One, because of the budget. We don't have a $27 billion shortfall. You may remember back in 2003, we had a $10 billion shortfall, and leadership stood tall and said, "We will live within our means. There will be no new taxes. There will be no tax increases." And they meant it, and we slashed health and human services to the bone. That's also the year, and I don't think I'm going to have time to tell the story. You'll have to invite me back. That was also the year that Tom DeLay came down from Washington, the House Majority Leader, and decided it was okay and not illegal to redraw congressional boundaries. And it was intended to get rid of 6 or 7 Democratic incumbent members of Congress by redistricting so that the incumbent Democratic members of Congress could not get reelected. Republicans would be guaranteed to be reelected. This was unprecedented. It had never been done, ever. A legislature had never redrawn lines in the middle of the decade unless a court, for some reason, had ordered it, a perceived violation of the Voting Rights Act. But DeLay came down, and that was the year that the Republicans took complete control of every statewide office, the House, the Senate. Tom Craddock was elected Speaker, the first Republican Speaker since Reconstruction. And a lot of that happened because Tom DeLay illegally funneled corporate money into races for the House, and that's how Tom DeLay became Speaker. So when DeLay came down and said, "This is what I want," the leadership, the governor, the Speaker, Lieutenant Governor, they all said, "Okay." And next thing we knew, toward the end of the session, the redistricting committee was called back to meet. We had done redistricting 3 years earlier, like every other state in the nation after the census comes out every 10 years. But they wanted it to be done again. So let me just tell you one part about it, because it was very exciting. We had to organize this. Talk about a community organizing project. We had to organize this in absolute secret while the legislature was in session. We had to get 51 Democratic members of the House, think about that, to commit to doing this. We had to organize it in secret. Nobody was allowed to tell anybody. And we tried to anticipate everything that might happen. We had lawyers, like a couple of lawyers and strategists, and we planned this. We planned it. So a lot of people wonder, but why did you go to Ardmore, Oklahoma? And the reason is simple. We knew we would have to get out of state. Charles and Dora here? Yeah. Remember the killer bees from 1979? They stayed in their house. They hid out. But that was just for a relatively short period. And yet, what we knew about that experience was that they sent the sergeants at arms, the state troopers, and the Texas Rangers all over to find them. Because while it's legal to break a quorum, per the House rules, the Speaker is authorized to use any means necessary to apprehend members who successfully break a quorum and bring them back. And so our lawyers were talking to lawyers from the governor's office and the attorney general's office of Oklahoma. Both of them at that time were Democrats. And we got assurances that if we could somehow, if the 51 of y'all can somehow make it across the Red River without getting busted by the Texas Rangers and the state troopers, and you make it into Oklahoma, we won't let them execute their arrest warrants. That's why we went to Ardmore, Oklahoma. It was the closest city in Oklahoma that had a Holiday Inn where we could stay. None of us really wanted to go to Ardmore, Oklahoma, except Jimmy Dunham, who has relatives there. So that's where we went. And we pulled it off. They did send the Texas Rangers and the state troopers and the sergeants, but we made it there. We were there. The only thing we never really anticipated was that Tom DeLay, who was in the House the morning that Craddock tried to convene the session, the day after Mother's Day, we were able to watch this on our laptops. We couldn't hear anything, but we could watch what was happening. And Tom DeLay, the parliamentarian, said, "Quorum, please sign in, members." And everybody signing in. And then you could see the two parliamentarians leaning over to the Speaker. And Tom DeLay was over on the side. And you could see the Speaker going, "What? What?" They had told him, "We don't have a quorum." I said, "What do you mean we don't have a quorum?" He said, "Well, it turns out that 51 Democrats took their keys so nobody could punch them in, and there's no quorum." Well, Tom DeLay was so out of sorts, was so exasperated and angry about this, that he decided to dispatch agents of the Department of Homeland Security to track us down. So think about that for a second. Homeland Security, created to protect you and your loved ones against terrorists. We were duly elected legislators from Texas. We happened to be Democrats. We broke no laws. We broke no rules. We broke a quorum. And they sent Homeland Security to track us down. And here's something else that, to me, is a little scary. In the end, there were 51 of us, quote, hiding out at the Holiday Inn in Ardmore, Oklahoma. The Rangers never found us. The troopers never found us. Homeland Security never found us. It took a cub reporter from the Dallas Morning News to out us. I have lots of stories about Ardmore. As you know, we came back as the killer D's, the killer Democrats, because we killed the bill. We killed the bill, and there was a rally where thousands of people came to welcome us back. But the session ended, and DeLay told the governor, "Call a special session. Keep calling special sessions until I get what I want." And that's what happened. So Democratic senators went to Albuquerque. And they stayed for a month and a half until one of them had a change of heart. and they came back. So in the end, DeLay got most of what he wanted until the U.S. Supreme Court overturned parts of it. And that's why Austin was then divided up into 3 separate congressional districts. This go-round, just to get rid of Lloyd Doggett, or to try to, they ended up dividing Austin into 5 separate congressional districts. And Tom DeLay, as you all know, is still on appeal. He was convicted for misappropriation of federal resources and illegally funneling, laundering corporate money into Texas races. So that's one of the reasons why I'm more optimistic about the next session. I mentioned the budget. So what am I talking about? I'm more optimistic because, as many of you know, probably all of you, a little over a year ago, the Democratic senators in Wisconsin broke a quorum, shut it down, went to Illinois over collective bargaining rights, okay, using our script from 2003 down to the letter. A senator named Spencer Coggs from Milwaukee was actually in conversations with a couple of us down here saying, well, what did you guys do when this happened? What did you do when this happened? The irony is that even if we had wanted to last session, the Democrats didn't have enough to break a quorum because the Republicans had a supermajority, which means theoretically they could do anything they wanted, whether 2 or 3 Democrats were there or all of us were there. It wouldn't matter. And I think it's interesting that the governor still had to call a special session at the end last time because they couldn't get all the bills they wanted, especially bills on the governor's emergency item. They couldn't get them all through, so they had to call a special session, even though theoretically we couldn't stop them from doing anything. So one reason I'm more optimistic is that now we have enough to break a quorum because we picked up 7 seats in the last election. So theoretically, if push comes to shove over something like guns or school vouchers, theoretically we can break a quorum, shut it down, go back to the Holiday Inn in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and hope that Willie Nelson, as he did in 2003, sends us that big box of bandanas, which we loved, and 2 cases of whiskey. Okay, so that's one of the reasons I'm more optimistic. And everyone knows that we have the potential that we could break a quorum this time. But let's go back to the budget. Remember $4 billion shortfall when I first ran, and then $10 billion shortfall in 2003 when we went to Oklahoma? Well, last session it was a $27 billion shortfall, and the leadership stood tall, had a press event, and said, $27 billion shortfall, we will live within our means, there will be no new taxes, no tax increases, and they even said, we won't even touch the rainy day fund, except they had to because there were some debts from the prior session. So they said, we will use it to cover some deficits from the prior session, but they said we will not touch it for anything this session, looking forward. And they meant it, and when I talk about the last session, I say the last session was the worst in the history of Texas government, but only if you care about kids, the elderly, minorities, people with disabilities, school children, health, human services, the environment, people in general. And it was bad. You all know that. Now we do not have a shortfall. We will have a projected surplus of $7 or $8 billion, but it's sort of shadowy or shady because a lot of that money is already going to be used up. We have to spend $4.7 billion for the Medicaid program, which we only funded for 18 months, not 24 months last session, and public ed, which we underfunded by $5 billion. As you all know, the governor has said, well, we may not use that money, that surplus money or rainy day money, for some of the programs that some of the members want, like public ed. He said, we may decide to give it back to the people. and that's going to be played out this session. He's saying that it's more important to give people back their money than to restore the cuts to health, human services, education. And I think we're going to have some major fights over that. Now, I can stop here and tell you a couple of funny and humiliating stories, or if you're dying to ask some questions or make some comments, we can do that. So, do you want to hear my most humiliating experience, or do you want some? You do? All right, this will just take a couple of minutes. It was my freshman year, and I had a bill. Some advocates had brought me a bill to make it easier to prosecute people who neglect and abandon their kittens, their pets. Pretty straightforward, simple bill. But they always like to haze a freshman. So it was my turn, I guess. The bill was put on the local and consent calendar. How could anybody be opposed to a bill that would simply make it easier to prosecute people who neglect or abandon or abuse their pets? But they did. So I'm laying out the bill. It was one of my first bills. I was a freshman, and I'm reading my notes, and I look at the back mic, and there are 10 members lined up at the back mic. And they were all what I positively, fondly describe as good old boy members. So the first one got up there and said something about, is this really intended to get at rodeos? And I said, no, this is just intended to help people, prosecutors, go after people who neglect their pets. It has nothing to do with rodeos. And then a member went to the back mic. There were a couple of other ridiculous questions. This member said, okay, Elliot, how would your bill affect farmers using dogs to round up piney woods rooters? He said, sometimes the dogs may chew an ear off a hog or two before we can get them loaded in a trailer. Your bill going to outlaw that? And I said, excuse me? Then Rob Janelle, who was chairman of appropriations, played linebacker for Texas Tech. He went to the back. He was lined up. He had a big stack of books. And he said, okay, representative, you're from, isn't it, New York City? He just screamed. I went, yes, sir. He said, so tell me, what's steer tripping? I said, what is what? He said, that's what I thought. And he took this pile of books, threw them down on the floor, stomped off. This went on for a while. The only time I've been on the front page of the Austin American-Statesman was the next morning, and it was a headline story, and it said, Freshman Rep Naishtat outfoxed and hogtied in the Texas House. So I've never done any kind of animal cruelty bill since then. That was my most humiliating experience. The funniest was when he was then a freshman. He's now in Congress, and his name is Joaquin Castro. And he was doing his first bill in the House. Tom Craddock was the speaker. And it wasn't a big bill. It was some simple bill. It wasn't controversial, meaning most people weren't listening. Joaquin's up there explaining his bill, and the speaker wasn't paying attention. Two parliamentarians were up there, and he was visiting with them. And then, all of a sudden, from the back mic, the speaker heard what he hears 100 times a day. He heard, Mr. Speaker, and Tom Craddock, without even looking up, said, for what purpose? Just into the mic, for what purpose? And then the questioner at the back said, will the gentleman yield for a question? At which point the speaker looked up. He wanted to see who the person was who wanted permission to ask a question. And what the speaker saw, Tom Craddock, was something that caused him to turn completely white, just white, like a deer in the headlights. Because what he saw was Joaquin Castro at the back mic asking permission to ask Joaquin Castro at the front mic a question. And it took Speaker Craddock probably 15 or 20 seconds. It was just... So, I know you figured it out. Julian Castro, Joaquin's twin brother, had been in the chamber that morning visiting with some of us. And when they made the announcement to clear the chamber because we're going to convene, a few of us said, Julian, why don't you take that newspaper and stay here? Just sit down there near the pages. Just sit there. And he said, yeah, that sounds good. And then in the middle of his brother Joaquin's remarks, we snuck him. And he literally crawled between 2 or 3 desks to get to the back mic. And then, of course, he said, Mr. Speaker, for what purpose? Will the gentleman yield? And that's what Craddock saw. And when Craddock figured it out, then he said, go ahead. Yeah, you can ask some questions. So Julian asked Joaquin some questions for a minute or so. That's the funniest thing I've ever seen in the House chamber. So let me stop now because I'm sure some of you have some comments or questions.
Raise your hands high so I can see you. We can get in a few questions. Dale Beulah.
Thank you for being here. I'll ask the question that I asked the last time you were here and the time before and the time before. I'm sure a lot of retired school teachers would like to know if there's a chance for any improvement in our retirement. We taught many, many years. We're always promised you won't make much money, but you'll have your teacher retirement in your cost of living. And that hasn't happened in, I think, a dozen years now. And we wonder why we can't recruit people into the teaching profession. Do you think there's any prayer of it even being considered? I'm guessing not.
No, I think there is. Remember, we're going to have a surplus, and we haven't had that in a long time. But we have a governor who has precluded the possibility of that happening if the legislature goes along with what he will be proposing, which is to give, is it all of y'all? Is that all y'all? Okay. It took me so long to learn how to say y'all, and then I started hearing all of y'all. Anyway, he wants to give all of y'all, or yous guys, back. He wants tax relief because that's what the people of Texas want. So if that happens, then we're looking at not reinstating the cuts in public ed or higher ed. The budget proposals from the Senate and the House do address the increases needed for more students, population growth. That's good. But they don't include restoring the money that was cut out of public ed, as a result of which teachers were laid off, class sizes are bigger, a lot of programs were cut. It was horrible. Part of what I describe as the worst session ever in the history of Texas government, if you care about these things. So I think that that issue is viewed favorably by both sides of the aisle. We know that COLA, that these have not happened and that they should. But now we're looking at the 800-pound gorilla, which is Governor Perry saying it's more important to give people back their money. And a lot of people go, why? How? And the answer is very simple. The people in power in Texas and the Republican leadership in this country do not believe that it's the role of government to do what Lyndon Johnson did with the New Deal to do. So, did I say Lyndon Johnson twice? I meant FDR. I meant FDR with the New Deal. They don't believe that's the role of government, and that's how things play out now. It's not the role of government. Some of these issues, health, human services for kids, children's health, Medicaid, they're important, so let the private sector do it. Let faith-based organizations, nonprofits, and church groups do it. But they don't have the wherewithal to do it. We all know that. And then they say, and let's outsource these programs. Let's privatize. And that usually means friends of leadership end up with these huge contracts, including for-profit human services corporations getting multi-million-dollar contracts to determine eligibility for programs like Medicaid, food stamps, welfare. And think about it. What's the bottom line for-profit human corporations? Is it providing the highest quality service or guaranteeing a certain return to their stockholders. Yes.
Representative Naishtat, could you give us just maybe some brief concluding words? This has been fascinating, your rich personal history and your current perspectives, but we're almost out of time, and we want to hear from you, just maybe a summary overview.
Well, the most important thing I can say is that all of you have a voice. You all vote, and that's great, but that should be step one of your involvement in the political process. And I don't care what political party you belong to, but it is incumbent on all of you and your friends and your family and your neighbors to speak up. And when you see that there's a good chance that there's a serious price to pay for kids, for retired teachers, for seniors, for people with disabilities, if the governor gets his way and we give, could be billions of dollars back to the taxpayers, tax relief, you need to weigh in. And that doesn't mean calling me or Mark Strama or Donna Howard or Eddie Rodriguez or Donna Dukes. It means calling people who you know might agree with the governor. It means going to see them, calling them, sending them letters, whether you're a constituent of theirs or not. Or get people who are constituents of theirs, because you know people in Wichita Falls and San Antonio and Abilene and maybe Eagle Pass, and call them and say, you've got to be in touch with the people who we know agree with the governor on this proposal. But you've got to look at lots of issues, not just that, and you must weigh in. And you have to do it individually, through advocacy groups, through organizations, but you must speak up. You must be more involved.
Thank you for this call to action for all of us, and thank you for coming and speaking with us today, Representative Naishtat.
Thank you all very much.